Hello, everyone, and welcome to Intelligent Enterprise Storytellers. My name is Rob Shannon. I'm the Managing Director and founder of the Intelligent Enterprise Leaders Alliance. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Roxanne Laczo to the program. Roxanne is the head of People Analytics at Cloudflare. Welcome, Roxanne.
Thank you, Rob. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. A lot to cover today. Roxanne also is one of our featured speakers at the upcoming People Analytics Exchange in June, late June in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're looking forward to hearing a lot more from Roxanne there. But today we're going to jump into a lot of really interesting issues and insights. And the first one, and sort of the theme of what we're going to talk about, is data-driven leadership and boosting manager and team performance. And the first sort of area I'd like to cover, Roxanne, is focus on measurement. I was captivated by your journey that led you to the convergence of psychology, statistics, and business, and was hoping you could elaborate just a bit on your career path and how measurement and analytics has been a consistent theme in all of your roles up to this point.
Yeah, absolutely happy to. So I would say I kind of fell into it. When I was in high school, I love math. I was one of those math nerds, love that. I also thought I liked psychology, but I never really knew how the two could intersect. So it was when I went to undergrad where I discovered statistics classes, I discovered psychology classes and psychology statistics classes, and I also discovered the business school. And I took an IO psychology, industrial organizational psychology class, and I realized this is the perfect combination of all three of those things. So that is really how I fell into kind of the measurement of the employee experience with that strong foundation of measurement and analytics. So my PhD is in IO psychology with a minor in statistics and measurement. So I feel like kind of just through circumstance and taking some different classes as an undergrad, I fell into this field and came to realize like, wow, there's a whole career path that can be many different things. And this concept of people analytics, which IO psychologists like to say that we've been doing it for about 50, 60 years now. It's really come into its own as a really unique function, and it's changed a lot. So I think kind of my background and my interest just really kind of combined very perfectly to arrive as a leader in this field.
That's such an interesting background. Very few of us, and a lot of the executives that I interview, rarely start out their journey knowing exactly what they want to do. They come somehow sort of stumble into it, much like myself. But I often like to ask people like yourself a question for people that are watching today that aspire to the kind of role and the kind of work that you're doing. What advice would you give them if they're sort of at the beginning of their career journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent a lot of time networking and mentoring people. And so I would say, something that really helped me a lot was establishing relationships and connections with people that were doing the type of work that I thought I wanted to do, that I thought I might want to do. So if you're early on and you're thinking about this type of career, I would just start reaching out to people and ask them for informal conversations. I've always found that even though people are busy, they're generally very able and willing to have a 15 or 30-minute conversation with you to talk about their career. Who doesn't love to talk about themselves and tell a little bit about what they've done? And it's a way not only to establish connections, it's also a way to learn a little bit about what are some of the different ways I can use these skills or this interest or this capability? What are some of the different roles and some of the different focus areas that are possible that I might want to think going down one of those paths? Because even in the field of people analytics, there's multiple different paths and multiple different roles that one could hold. It's very multifaceted. So I really encourage people to network as much as possible, go to conferences, come to the People Analytics Exchange in Minneapolis, go to any other local conferences, attend webinars, just really get to know some of the people in the scene, and don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions.
That's great advice. We study a lot in the analytics space, but also in human resources. And obviously this is a blend of both, but mentorship is constantly a theme that comes up. And so I think that's just absolutely fantastic practical advice for people just starting out, which is a good segue to maybe the next sort of theme that we're going to talk about around measuring manager effectiveness. And you've discussed the gaps between manager effectiveness and the relationships with their teams. And I was wondering how you've supported managers in the past to improve in their roles and what impact that's ultimately had on the employee experience.
Yeah, so let's just talk a little bit about how I define manager effectiveness versus how I define manager relationship. So this is a concept that I think has always existed, but in a lot of the survey research that I've done in my past is really where we started to differentiate it and see there's actually really big differences in some of the big gaps that you just mentioned. So So when I think about manager effectiveness, I think it's the broader set of skills, competencies, capabilities that are really necessary to lead and manage a team to attain organizational goals. So it's, how do you set goals? How do you articulate performance goals to your team? How do you provide performance feedback? How do you help your team execute on expectations? How you ensure that your team is enabled to do those things? I really think of that as kind of manager 101 in terms of doing manager things that enable performance. Then when I think about manager relationship, which I kind of define very differently, it's really around the interpersonal, some might call it the softer side of being a manager. What is the quality of the interaction, the relationship between you and your team? Are you able to establish, maintain positive, trustworthy, authentic relationships? Can you build rapport? That kind of thing. In every company I've been where we've looked at these two very kind of distinct constructs around manager, we've seen gaps. And the gaps are almost always around, I really have a great quality relationship with my manager. I like my manager. I trust my manager. I would work for my manager again. Then when we see some of the gaps are, I don't have regular performance conversations with my manager. I'm not sure how my work relates to organizational goals. I haven't had a one-on-one in X amount of time. So those are two very distinct things. And I've really honed in on this concept of manager effectiveness. And it's actually really starting to gain a lot more visibility and traction. You'll see different articles coming up about it. I've really relied on what I'll call a multifaceted approach. So there's many different ways to measure this. And depending on the organization I've been with at the time, the maturity of the organization, the tenure of the managers in that organization, the readiness or the willingness of the leaders in a specific business to really engage with this, it's really kind of varied what my approach has been. So I'll kind of list a few of the things. So when you identify maybe there's some gaps in manager effectiveness, there's very basic, simple things that we probably all have access to in organizations around tools and resources, right? Training programs. Do you have targeted internal training sessions in your online learning platform around coaching, communication skills, how to have performance conversations, how to have constructive or challenging conversations, kind of some of the basics. What I think really ties in with that are the actual resources. So one of the first companies I worked at where we really dug into this, we provided a ton of resources to enable managers. So literally little templates around, here are the different steps, some of the questions you should ask, the things you should track when you have a one-on-one conversation. Here's some of the things you need to discuss when you have a development discussion. Here's the boxes to check. Here's the questions to ask. So really enabling managers with all the information they need to have these conversations. Kind of a second step to that, and I have a pretty broad experience and background in executive coaching and assessment as well. It's like my other side life. Really developmental assessment and coaching. So there are many tools and inventories out there right now. I could probably have a whole webinar talking about those that are really useful in identifying and developing strategic self-awareness and identifying gaps in leadership skills and capabilities. You can tie an assessment with the results into a coaching session, into one-on-one coaching to really provide individualized support to help managers learn and grow in some of the areas where maybe they're lacking some of those skills or experiences. There's also something around 360s and other mechanisms. I think when we talk about manager effectiveness, we forget that managers also have managers who probably also have managers. And the impact of a bad manager can trickle all the way down, right? So is your organization or your team engaging in a really robust strategic 360-degree feedback mechanism? So we're kind of enabling managers at every level of the organization. So you're creating and enabling skills and capability for everyone. And the last thing I'm going to call out is really more of like using technology. Manager one-on-one cadence is among the strongest predictors of engagement and perceptions of support. This has a trickle-down effect to bottom line revenue. So I really think if I was to only ever measure one thing in the organization, it would absolutely be manager effectiveness.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Roxanne. There's a lot to unpack in that description. There was a lot of meat there. And I do have some follow-up questions. The first one is just wondering, in terms of the feedback that you get from managers, so when you talk about putting in these various templates and methodologies, do you get a lot of pushback? And if so, maybe can you talk to us a little bit about tips for people that might be thinking of doing the same kinds of things, how to perhaps coax managers along and be more receptive to these kind of frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's no magic pill. There's no, one answer that solves this problem. I think what's really important is you actually have to step back and ensuring that you're establishing the strong relationships with your stakeholders across HR and across the business to really make this happen. So your HR business partners need to be your best friends when it comes to this stuff. Depending how you have that team or organization structure in your organization, they're often the people that are the first point of contact for managers. So the business partners have to be totally on board and aligned with what it is what you're doing. And I think part of the role of the business partners is actually to ensure that the leaders of the businesses are also aligned. So it's always going to be kind of most impactful, I think, when you have the heads of the business communicating the importance of all these things. That's going to get the manager buy-in in a very different way. And of course, where you can, if you can tie what you're doing, and then we'll probably touch on this in a little bit, tie what you're doing, how you're measuring it to actual hard dollar financial outputs, that's going to be the hook to really get your managers on board. When you can show them the data that says people in your role in this other business who are doing all of these things actually have a 2 times impact on the bottom line of their business, that's going to be kind of the strategic business case that you need to get everybody on board.
I'm glad you mentioned that. That was definitely another one of my questions around objectives and key results. So we'll hang tight and wait till we get to that point a little later in the conversation. But I'm glad you brought that up. Everyone we talk to, and I'm sure it's no different for you, wants to talk about AI and whether AI plays a role in management effectiveness or HR programs. I can't remember the last conversation I had with an executive where that topic of AI did not come up. So I feel required to ask about the role that AI is playing in your program, if any.
Yeah, so it is not currently playing a role, but certainly, like you said, I can't remember the last time I've had a conversation around this where we're not thinking about it. So what I will say is, actively exploring different mechanisms and opportunities. I mean, even outside of manager effectiveness, right? How can AI help impact the HR organization? And there's a lot of very simple ways, and there's some more complicated ways. How do you enhance how people and people leaders are interacting with their team members? So imagine a scenario where you're looking at what I'll call workflow activity, emails coming in and out, meetings that you're having, chat activity. How do you embed that with survey results? How do you embed that with 360 feedback, as an example? And I actually presented on this just last week and kind of gave the example of, imagine a scenario where your tool or your ecosystem, your tech stack is actually embedding and integrating all of this information together. So it's looking at what are manager daily activities? How much time are you spending with each of your direct reports? How often are you canceling one-on-ones? How often are you having one-on-ones? Are you somehow providing an inordinate amount of time with one person over the other? They can embed that using their underlying AI capabilities into the results of a listing program and start to feed to you specific targeted actions around, Roxanne, you only had one-on-one with Rob last month, but you had 5 with Mike, right? So it's like, here's a recommendation for spending more time with Rob. Here's some resources tied to having more positive interactions, how to have constructive conversations, how to frame a one-on-one, etc. Linking that back as you continue to measure over time to see, is this actually having an impact on the upward feedback I'm getting from my team around my manager effectiveness? Am I having high quality conversations? Do my team think that I'm giving them what they need to actually be effective? So there's some really cool capabilities that have come out now, and there's many vendors that do this type of thing that really enable managers to be effective in ways that doesn't reduce or take a strain on their cognitive capacity. We talk about manager effectiveness, but you also think, I'm a manager. We have a million things going on. We have a million sources of data coming our way every day. How do we possibly sit back and intake all of that information? And by the way, do our real job, right? And actually do it effectively. So these AI assisted kind of actions and nudges are really a way to help managers focus on what's important or what might be a priority based off the activities and the data that it's feeding in together.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because so many of the conversations that collectively we have are around this big picture strategy and how AI is going to just change the world for HR. But that was a great practical example of how it could be used every day in the organization, which kind of brings me to the next question I have around the key results and outcomes that you've seen. I know you mentioned earlier a revenue outcome,
Yep.
and I definitely would like to hear a little bit about that. But I did have a question before we get there, which is a lot of what I'm hearing in this discussion is around leadership development. It's around how to make managers more effective, which in turn presumably enables them to give back more to the business and extract more from their people. So in addition to the revenue outcomes that you've seen, that I'd like to hear a lot more about, has the organization seen any tangible human outcomes in terms of leadership development, succession planning, and things like that?
So Rob, I cut out for just a second, so I missed the first half of your question. So sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I guess we'll restart. Can you hear me now okay?
Yep.
All right. So one of the things that is on my mind as you talk about outcomes, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the revenue outcomes that the organization has been able to see, but it's around leadership development. So a lot of what I'm hearing are tools that you've been able to create for managers in the organization that are enabling them to presumably extract more from their people, but at the same time, increase their game and the quality of their day-to-day work. And I was wondering, in addition to the revenue outcomes, what people outcomes perhaps you've seen at the management level in terms of their development and or succession planning, if any?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to go back to some of my previous experience. So I was a senior consultant at Hogan Assessment Systems before my current job. So I kind of jumped ship from the internal piece to external consulting. And what I did there was almost exclusively either pre-hire assessment for senior leaders and mid-level managers, or development and assessment-based coaching and debriefs for internal employees, right? And so what this is all about, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, was creating strategic self-awareness for managers. So kind of depending how your assessment profile comes out, that's going to give you some clues and some feedback around how am I likely to come across when I give feedback? Do I have a more harsh approach? Do I have a very soft approach? What are the advantages and disadvantages of both? Because there are pluses and minuses to both of those things. And how can I think about really adjusting my approach where necessary, and thinking about how my team is going to intake that? I think there's this kind of old school saying that managers don't adjust to their people adjust to their managers. And I think it's absolutely false. And it's a really outdated way of thinking about it. Managers have to have that emotional intelligence and capability to be able to adjust their approach to their different team members, because everybody needs something different. There's some commonalities, but there's also some very unique ways that you need to engage with a person to really instill the best of them and really drive high performance. So for me, when I'm thinking about this development piece, some of it is really around like creating that self-awareness around some of your softer skills, and really around what is the quality of the relationships that you're creating? What are some of the things that are maybe innate in your nature that you're not even thinking about might be having an impact on people that's detracting from their performance? And how can you think about reframing the relationship you have, not only with your teams, with your peers, with your customers, whomever it might be, to really reframe that relationship to really encourage high performance and really increase the quality and authenticity of that relationship to drive that value on the other side.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's great insight. So back to the revenue outcomes, which I know is something near and dear to your heart. Can you talk to us a little bit about how improving manager effectiveness is translated into increased revenue for the business?
Absolutely. So there's actually a lot of research out there as well in the IO psychology literature. Research really around how does employee engagement or satisfaction yield business outcomes. Some of this is a little older than others, but there's a meta-analysis out there that was done, I think, like 20 years ago by Gallup, that was one of the first to really show what that relationship was, and to prove using data from multiple different companies that, manager effectiveness and capability leads to employee engagement, which can lead to business outcomes. So I worked at a retail organization at the time when a lot of this was really hot. And I remember thinking at the time, like, oh my goodness, this data is so challenging, it's so hard. But now I look back and I think we had the perfect unit of analysis, which is a retail store that all measure the same metrics and have the same outcomes. We partnered with a vendor and we were able to look at leadership behaviors, manager effectiveness and capability. We had a specific measurement around that, an upward feedback mechanism. We linked that to, at the time, what was our engagement survey. So we're able to draw those links. And number one, we were able to say that people who are rated as more highly effective and high quality managers created more engaged employees. Because this is a retail organization, we're also able to link employee engagement to customer outcomes. And guess what? The more highly engaged the people in your store were, the higher your customer outcomes, not only from like an NPS standpoint, but down to the revenue impact. We actually built this thing at the time. We called it a simulator, but basically it was like a kind of a really fancy spreadsheet back in those days, right? I know we've really upskilled our tools and mechanisms since then, but we were basically able to model out what would a 1-point impact in any single element that we measured around leadership capability or employee engagement have on customers and outcomes. So increased manager effectiveness around having performance conversations led to, I'm making this number up, $10,000 increase per store in revenue on average over a year, right? So if you have that data available to you, doing that linkage analysis and bringing in the leadership, the customer, and the employee piece, that can be a really, really powerful tool. The challenge I've had in a lot of other organizations I've worked in is we don't always have that unit of analysis as readily available. And when you think about more of a corporate environment, it's a lot harder to measure impact on customer and revenue. But if you're in a situation or organization where you have sales outcomes, where you have units of analysis that are common and consistent across the organization, you absolutely can and should be linking all of those different pieces together to look at how variations in leadership behaviors and capabilities impact customers and employees and bottom line financial results.
We're going to get to in a couple of minutes here some communication strategies I know that you've put into place to communicate with stakeholders. And I'm imagining nothing gets the attention of the board or stakeholders like increasing per unit sales or increasing store results. So I can imagine there's some great wins there. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about the team and, diving back into your background in statistics and analysis. I've often heard you talk about asking probing questions to get to the heart of an issue and uncovering why high potential talent might be leaving an organization. So there's a lot of leaders out there that are very concerned with this war for talent that seems like it's been raging on forever, right? We want to keep our talent in place. And I'm wondering what advice you might be able to give us or what stories you might be able to share around that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we do a lot in people analytics is we talk about, we have to be able to ask the right questions, right? And it's getting at exactly what you're referring to here is, a stakeholder, a business partner, a leader comes to you and says, turnover's gone up. What's the problem? That's like the start, like that's the outcome. That's like the first thing, but you really need to think about, is that the question that we should be asking? Or is that just the outcome that there's all these other things are impacting, right? So first of all, let's just pick on turnover for a second. There's cyclical turnover. There's healthy levels of turnover. What kind of turnover is it? Is it voluntary, involuntary, regrettable, non-regrettable? Sometimes you want to have a certain level of churn. And depending on the industry and the business, right, and the types of roles, you might expect that differently. When I think about some of the turnover measurement I've done in the last 4 to 5 years, we had a pandemic. That kind of changed the game on everything. We had the Great Resignation, right? And then we had like the great hire everybody you can. And then we had that, okay, stop the hiring and stop laying off people. So when I think about the last few years, it's not really about what was going on with turnover. It's like, what are all the other macro and micro conditions that are leading to that? But getting back to your first question, if a leader or somebody comes to me and says, well, I want to look at turnover, I think we're losing our high potentials. Why is that happening? So let's go back to our friend manager effectiveness. Do these leaders have managers that are effective and capable and experienced enough to help them learn and grow and develop in their career? The thing with a high potential person or someone who kind of has that capability to do a lot and do more is you can't continue to do the same thing with them and expect that they're going to continue to be high potential or continue to engage with you. There's this old analogy I used to do, and it's a Walt Disney analogy. When Walt Disney came out with the 3 Little Pigs, people were like, oh my God, we love it. We love it. We want more pigs. We want more pigs. And he said, listen, you can't top pigs with pigs, right? And so what he's getting at is we actually have to think of something new and different because we can't continue to do the same thing. So high potential turnover, what are the root causes? Are you changing the way that you run your business? Do you have managers that are not effective at actually engaging, motivating, developing high potentials? Do you need to think differently about creating high potential development programs for critical talent? Do you have the internal resources to do that? Do you have the external resources to do that? Is there really something else going on? So I'm thinking back to a manufacturing company I worked for at one point. and we saw that there was a really big drop in engagement in certain business. So there was kind of like, what the heck is going on? Well, there had been announcements that some of the plants were going to close. So it wasn't that people weren't disengaged. People had a really strong sense of fear around what their future held and what job security was. This is an organization where like people loved the company. It was very much felt like your family, you know, people working together side by side every day in these manufacturing facilities. The threat of losing that part of your life was so strong, and it manifested in survey results as a lack of engagement. But that's not really what it was about. It was about they had no idea what was going to happen if this rumor was true that these plants would close. So you really have to be able to ask questions and peel back the layers of the onion to really get at the heart of like what is actually going on. And then you kind of start to talk about, well, is this a problem? Yes or no? Is turnover really the thing we're worried about? Or is it the fact that we don't have managers that can actually manage really high potential, really high performing people to the level that we want them to?
Thanks for sharing that. That's a really useful framework for any manager out there that's going through some similar conditions. And I think virtually all are.
Yeah.
There's another area I want to talk about. And this is something really near and dear to my heart, particularly of late. We are doing a lot of research around the current talent acquisition environment when it comes to high tech skills, particularly now with AI. We've talked about that. But I know that you've done some work in this area as well in terms of adapting and identifying and evaluating, fulfilling necessary roles and skills within your teams. This is a huge issue at the moment with the supply-demand imbalance in terms of technical talent that's out there. And so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this subject and some of the things that you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another one of those things where I wish there was just an easy solution that we could all use to answer these problems. But it's kind of like AI. It's somewhat new and it's continually evolving. So we have to continually to think and evolve in different ways. And so when I think about how do we adapt to kind of think about the future skills and what's necessary in the future? Number one, we have to have a really good grasp of what our future organizational strategy is, right? Like we shouldn't be building for today. We should be building for whatever that looks like in the future. So if you're in a high growth scenario, that's probably going to be a very different strategy you have around what skills and technology you need than if you're at a very long established company that's been around for many, many years, that's really just focusing on kind of maintaining the status quo versus growing the business in a different way. Two very different scenarios. But I think when I think about like the people that you have internally, you have to be able to have some sort of assessment or skills assessment. And again, this is easier said than done, just to understand what are the gaps that we have right now in terms of what are some of the capabilities that we need to have in the future. So you're not a very high growth scenario. You need a lot of innovation. You need a lot of curiosity. You need a lot of thinking outside of the box. How does that exist in your current organization right now, and where are those gaps, right? So there's skills-based assessments. There's lots of different ways to think about and measure that. Companies do it lots of different ways. The right way or the best way really going to depend on where your company is in the moment. But again, at the same time, it's around, can you create and upskill those skills and capabilities in your organization? So what are the opportunities for continuous learning, development, growth opportunities that are aligning with emerging technologies, industry trends? Who's following those? Who's working together holistically across the organization to really identify what those all should be? This is another great example of, it takes an army. This is not just your L&D team. This is not just your people analytics team. This is not just a business leader, right? This is all of these teams working really well together to really assess and measure and define what that strategy is going to look like. And it might vary depending on the business. Your sales team might have a very different set of needs and strategies for growth than your engineering team, who might be developing product, right? So two very different things. You mentioned talent acquisition. So I think when you're thinking about your hiring strategy, and again, we could have a whole webinar on this. Are you hiring for what you currently need? Are you just looking at a static job description saying we need these boxes filled? Or are you hiring for the potential of people to learn and grow more? And those are two very different things. And by the way, getting back to assessment and pre-hire assessment, there's ways to help you identify people who are more likely to have the skills and capabilities to grow and be innovative in a very different way that you can't always get from kind of a static interview situation. Strategic workforce planning, of course. Again, companies are at very different levels and phases. This is going to require a really strong partnership between finance, between recruiting, between your people analytics team, if you own pieces of that, really looking at, can we predict and model what the future skill needs are, and how do we have to adjust or change our hiring strategy? to do that. And then kind of finally, I think something really important is succession planning. Where are you in the succession planning journey? Do you have succession plans built for your most senior leaders? Have you done a really thorough analysis of like, who are the people that are ready immediately? Who are the people that will be ready in 2 to 3 years, but they need X, Y, Z development and training opportunities? So lots of different pieces that come together. But I think the most important thing is you really need a cross-functional team to really design and evaluate and measure to build that strategy.
Great answer. And I may just take you up on that other webinar because there is a lot more to uncover. And we are coming up on time, unfortunately. Just time for one more question, actually. And it's a good segue, what you just talked about, as far as the community of stakeholders, depending upon the particular issue or issues you're trying to solve. And so you've mentioned the importance of not just delivering the insights, but also ensuring a continued impact throughout the organization. And so before we leave today, I was hoping you can talk about the strategies that you find most effective for communicating results to stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things with that. And we touched on it earlier. When you can integrate your insights around your talent with business outcomes, that's going to be your best possible scenario, right? Like really kind of get people where they understand like these decisions that we're making or not making are actually having an impact on what we're producing on the other end. That's going to have your immediate impact. But when I step back and I just think about what has been really effective, I feel for me like it's oftentimes the most simple ways of communicating data. It's the most simple ways of analyzing data that have the biggest impact. I think we have a tendency in people analytics and just kind of in general to think, we have to do all these really fancy predictive and prescriptive things. We have to use machine learning. We have to do these really fancy models. And the downside of that is I think there's not a lot of end users that can understand what it means, right? So I'm all about keep it simple. If I can show a mean difference in manager effectiveness scores and a mean difference that correlates or predicts business outcomes, I don't need to do anything really fancy. Of course, there's a lot more to that behind the scenes, but I think sophisticated does not equal overly fancy necessarily. Like complicated does not mean the best analysis just because it's complicated. Do your analysis, get your insights, deliver it in a way that's simple for people to understand. They can immediately see what the impact of that was. They can describe it to other people. They don't have to have a PhD in statistics to be able to describe the analysis or the results. Produce it and share it in a way that's really easy for people to intake and immediately understand what the end result is.
Thanks, Roxanne. There's so much to unpack here today, which is going to be of great value to everyone that's watching this webinar. So I want to thank you again on behalf of the Intelligent Enterprise Leaders Alliance for all of the work that you've put into this and for sharing these great insights. No doubt many, many people are going to benefit from that. So thank you once again. And for those of you that are watching this, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to follow us on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nothing will keep us together.